I just made a video about workbenches, and I got all serious at the end, and I wagged my finger and I said, listen, save your fancy new ideas. Build something time-tested, something traditional. And listen, I don't love traditional solutions because they're traditional. I love them because they usually work. The problem is, when you get too deep into a traditional mindset, you might be blind to innovation. Like when my buddy Brad texted me and said, hey, I just found this crazy marking gauge. Have you ever seen one like this before? And I hadn't, which is weird. And, it's very obvious what this thing does. It's got a beam, a wedge, a screw for scribing. It's a marking gauge. But it is completely different in shape and construction than any gauge I've ever seen. You hold it differently. It sits on the wood differently. It's harder to make than any gauge I own. Somebody went to a lot of extra trouble to make this thing. Okay, but why? Let's begin with the obvious. This thing has an enormous fence. Lots of surface area, lots of registration against the work. The fence is also radiused, so the gauge will follow an inside curve. That's probably handy for all sorts of special applications. I like the wedge design. It's very clever. You tighten it with your index finger and loosen it with your thumb. Everything's one-handed, and it's really easy. This thing is also it's very comfortable. I'm so used to English pattern gauges, I never noticed how sort of clunky they are in the hand. This thing feels wonderful. I could hold it all day. So, is all the extra time and materials for this thing actually worth it? Only one way to find out. The original gauge is made out of some tough, open-grained wood. So I'm going with white oak. It's hard, and it can stand up to years of banging around the shop. I'm using the original gauge for all of my measurements and just making a direct copy. Of course, I spent hours researching this mysterious tool, and I didn't come up with very much. The closest I could find was this one, also made of oak, similar in shape and style. This one was on eBay, and the seller called it a fish head gauge. And since it was on eBay, I bought it, obviously. And you know what? It really does look like a fish head. This gauge is associated with carriage makers, who often needed to mark lines along a curve. There's also a similar gauge called a grasshopper that could reach over an edge to mark something. These were often used by house joiners making curved handrails for fancy staircases. I think this tool was used in a couple of common trades, but it's mostly forgotten today. Anyhow, once my billet was dimensioned, I carefully planed my reference face and reference edge. I took a lot of time getting these surfaces perfectly square. Tool making demands precision in a way that furniture making doesn't. So I'm also breaking out my fancy adjustable pin marking gauge and setting it to a 3/8 inch chisel. Get your pins centered on the stock and then do all of your marking from the reference face and edge. These are the only trustworthy surfaces. So mark one side of your mortise and then flip your piece end over end. This keeps your gauge against the reference edge as you mark the other side. I've penciled in the ends of each mortise, and now I'm coming back with a knife and square to sever the fibers and define the opening. This mortise will house the wedge, and the top needs to be angled. I've made the mortise 1/8 inch taller on one side, and that's going to give me a perfect taper. If any of this is confusing, I have a full set of plans, and those are linked down in the description. You'll never get a big mortise chisel into these tiny mortises, so bevel edge chisels are the perfect tool. Even though I'm not making furniture, I still use my standard technique. Bevel plumb and facing me, chisel angled back. Confident taps with the mallet, and I'm staying away from both ends of the mortise and leaving waste so I have something to pry against. Every edge of this mortise is going to be visible in the finished product, so you have to be extra careful. Work from each side until you break through in the middle and get most of the waste out. Then you can drop your chisel into your knife lines and carefully chop to get crisp edges. You can see that I've also penciled in a line connecting the tall and short openings of the mortise. That angled line helped me trim the roof into a smooth taper that will hold the wedge. Now, my first mortise is done, and the other one isn't angled, so it's easier to cut. The two mortises need to intersect, so I've carried the bottom of the first mortise around the corner, and that line is going to give me the top of my second mortise. I've reset my gauge for a 1/2 inch chisel and recentered it. This face is narrower than the other one. I'll still gauge my lines, keeping the fence against a reference surface. Chopping this mortise is straightforward, and pretty soon it's time to make the beam. I rough cut the stock oversize, and then slowly plane the beam to fit the mortise. I've penciled an arrow on the end of my beam and a matching arrow on my fence. With these marks, I'm always testing the beam in the same orientation. Getting confused and flipping the work around is a great way to make no progress at all. Consistency is the key to good work. If you're slow and patient, you'll get a tight fit that still slides nicely. It also looks like I've made a little wooden robot. Awesome! Now I can shape another piece of scrap until it just fits into the larger end of my tapered mortise. Then I can use my angled line to transfer that taper onto my wedge stock. I'm paring my taper with a chisel, but you could also put a plane upside down in your vise and pull the wood over the blade until you get down to your line. That technique is probably easier and more predictable, but being able to freehand a shape with your chisel is also a valuable skill. But here's the trick. Even if you make your two mortises perfectly, you're probably going to find that that wedge isn't going to grab your beam and stop it. Those mortises, they just barely intersect, and that's not enough to get the friction that you need. The original craftsman who made this gauge had a pretty clever solution. He took a strip of copper, you can just see it because it's quite tarnished, and he threaded it through there and bent it up. And when you push the wedge in, it deforms that soft metal, presses it down into the beam, and stops it from moving. It's pretty clever, and I have plenty of copper sitting around my shop because I'm a hoarder, but I know a lot of people don't, and there's a lot of downsides to this. There's sharp bits sticking up just where you want to put your fingers. This is an inelegant solution, and I think we can do better. Instead of using the copper, I'm just going to thread the blade of my turning saw into the wedge mortise and saw down the floor just a fraction of an inch. Then I can very carefully chop out a tiny bit of wood. Now, the two mortises overlap, just a little, and when I slide my wedge in, it grabs the beam and locks it in place. I can saw my wedge free and test the completed mechanism. This is my favorite part of any project. Everything works and everything's fitted together. I no longer have to worry about losing a measurement or messing up an angle. Now I can get on to the detailing, and that part is fun. You're going to be pushing on the ends of the wedge as you lock and unlock the gauge. I also like to tap that wedge right on the bench top to lock it in, so the ends need to be a shape that's going to be comfortable and durable. Nice curved chamfers are the perfect thing, but working on this little piece calls for some creative work holding. You can also lay a sheet of sandpaper down on your bench top and drag the wedge to shape those corners. I know some woodworkers say you shouldn't use sandpaper for shaping, but I honestly have no idea why anyone would say that. A nice piece of 100 grit is perfect for some tasks. It's easy to shape the fence into something comfortable. My oil can has the perfect radius, and laying out good curves is a snap. If you'd rather just copy my design, the plans have a printable template that shows you where to cut and where to chamfer, so you'll get it right on the first try. My shop-made turning saw gets rid of most of the waste, but I'm staying pretty far away from my lines. This would be a terrible time to mess up. White oak slices very cleanly, so I can use a controlled, bevel-down chisel cut to ride those curves and get right down to my lines. It's hard to hold a small piece while you do this kind of chisel work. The vise usually won't grip it tightly enough, so I grip it with a holdfast and then put a piece of scrap between the work and my planing stop. Now the piece literally cannot move as I chisel it. It's worth taking a second to figure out these work-holding tricks. You'll end up with a nicer piece. All the corners of the fence need a nice rounded chamfer, and you can just pencil in some guidelines freehand. I use a combination of a rasp, a spoke shave, and a carving knife to take off most of those corners. Those tools give me good control for removing waste, but my surfaces are still too rough, so I refine them with a scraper. I also scrape all of my flat surfaces to get rid of my layout lines. Then, I use a bit of fine sandpaper, especially in the curves where there's a lot of end grain. Those areas are tough to get smooth. Sandpaper really helps. The last step is to install the cutter in the beam. I like to saw a little way into the end. Then, put it over a dog hole and tap in a finishing nail. I also add a little super glue to hold the nail in place. Since the nail comes sharp, you might want to just leave it. Unfortunately, that little point is just going to scratch the wood, which is what people don't like about wooden gauges. Most woodworkers want a slicing action, and you can get that if you just file the tip into more of a knife shape with a smooth curve from front to back and shallow bevels on either side. If you want to get really fancy, you can even hone the cutter with a little chunk of sharpening stone. This isn't necessary, I'm just showing off. Linseed oil makes the perfect tool finish. It gives a little protection from dirt and glue, but doesn't make the tool slippery. I don't even wait for it to dry. I just assembled the tool and was done. Now, I've made a pretty faithful copy of the original gauge. I've just made one change. Right here on the narrow end of the wedge, you can see I've installed a little pin. It's just a piece of bamboo chopstick. Because when you've got a lot of tension on this wedge and you go to release it, there's a lot of force there, and this wedge might just go sailing across the shop. And if you've got shavings and stuff on the floor, forget about it. Just make a new wedge. You are never going to find this again. So making that little alteration, that can save you a lot of trouble. Now, here's how you actually use the gauge and set it up. I like to leave the wedge loose and just hold my index finger lightly against the beam. That lets me shift it back and forth really easily. Let's say I've got a piece of work and I've got to get the gauge to match up with a pencil line. It's very easy to slide that beam back and forth until I'm close to my pencil line. I don't have to get it exact because I can pull with my index finger, lock that wedge in place loosely, and it's very easy to micro adjust the gauge just by tapping it back and forth against the work or the bench. Once I'm exactly on my line, like I am now, I'll just pull again and give it a quick tap. That locks that wedge in place very sturdily. It's going to hold that setting all day. Everything I need to do to adjust this gauge, I can do it one-handed. And I love that because, when you're doing real woodworking projects, there's lots of times when you don't have two free hands. Now, that's all very nice, but you also get one-handed operation from the more traditional marking gauge. These are cheap, super easy to make, and quick. I've got a whole video about it, and really, anybody can make one of these. So why would we go through the extra trouble and use up the extra material to make this more complicated style of gauge? Well, a couple of reasons. For one thing is just comfort. I've been using these gauges for so long, I never realized the fences are not very comfortable. This fence just melts into your hand. You can use it for hours, and it's very pleasant. The bigger problem is if you're trying to mark a line very far away from your fence. So I have this gauge set up about 4 inches away from the fence. If I need to mark that line, well, it's not easy to do because this large setting is exerting a lot of leverage on the fence, and the fence is kind of tiny. So as you're trying to make the mark, it's going to wiggle back and forth and skitter along the board. You're probably not going to get a super straight line. A lot of woodworkers resort to the old two-handed grip to guide the gauge, and that works fine as long as you have 2 hands available. Of course, there's lots of times when you don't have 2 hands, and this is where the fish head gauge really works well. Let me set it for a long setting, just like with the other one. And with this super big fence, there is tons of registration surface. When I angle it to make the mark, there's just a lot of gauge in contact with the wood. And as I push it forward to make my line, it travels smooth and straight, and I get a perfectly straight line. Of course, I also do a lot of marking along the edges of boards for stuff like thicknessing. Let me reset my gauge. Now I've got a narrow setting, like I would use on the edge of a board, and here's where this gauge just can't go wrong. That enormous fence gives you huge contact, and you're going to be able to strike that line really confidently, really accurately, every time. Now, I've made this gauge flat because I mostly do flat work, not a lot of curves, but if you just took a hand plane and knocked off those corners, you could make this gauge suitable for doing inside curves. That could be useful for all sorts of specialized work. This is a versatile tool. So, should you go and make a bunch of these things? Probably not. Honestly, the traditional gauge is fine for most of the work you do in the shop. This is much more of a specialty tool, and I suggest you make one of them. Have it in your toolkit and pull it out for those unusual circumstances where you need something a little different, something to get you out of a tight spot. This gauge is perfect for that. If you'd like to make it, I have an excellent set of plans. As usual, they are very affordable. And if you're interested in equipping your home shop cheaply, I have so many plans and projects for tools you can make yourself. I've got my Specialty Plane bundle and my Journeyman's Plan bundle, and both of these are jam-packed with money-saving, useful projects, so you can get your shop set up and get to work. I've linked to those down in the description, and you can check them out at rexkruger.com/store, along with literally dozens of other plans and projects that you might want to do. Now, if you enjoyed this project, it's going to be featured in the upcoming issue of Quercus magazine. This is my new favorite woodworking magazine. It's British, and it is all about obscure hand tool woodworking. If you're interested in this kind of thing, I am also in the previous issue talking about some unusual old hand planes. You can subscribe to Quercus online, or you can buy individual issues at Tools for Working Wood. I will link to those down in the description as well. Quick shout out to my buddy Brad, who found this thing and mailed it to me from Texas. You can subscribe to Brad's outstanding woodturning channel at Brad's Woodturning. And just like always, I've got to thank my patrons on Patreon. Think about this video just for a second. I got to spend my week researching and recreating a super weird, niche, rare old tool, and then making a video about it to share it with the entire world for free. I only get to do this because of my patrons. They make my super bizarre job possible. They provide the support that makes all of this possible. If you'd like to be one of those people, go on over to patreon.com/RexKruger and check out all the perks and rewards I have for the people who support this channel. I'll see everybody next week with another great woodworking project. Thanks so much for watching.